What do you think? Yeah, okay. So welcome everybody. It's great to see you, as I said already, and you're starting to feel pretty familiar. I'm recognizing your faces and your names, and loving the sense of community that's forming here. Week 6 already. So, and welcome to our special guest, Jen Gobby. She's here. We listened to the webinar that was about where she was talking about her study and her book, More Powerful Together. Thank you for your good, hard, diligent research, Jen, your dedicated study and your theory of transformative change. And I pray that many can converse with all of your work and learn from its wisdom and put it to work. So thank you very much for being here. And we're looking forward to hearing from you in just a little bit. We also this week, we listened to 2 chapters from A Good War. And so we continue to look at how Canada mobilized on a dime in World War II in the time of an emergency. And we look at how we can do something like that in our current climate emergency. So we read a chapter this week about the mistakes that were made. And then we also read a chapter about how we need to transform our politics. And so for those of us that are here who follow the Christian calendar, we have just entered into the season of Lent. So let's take our cues again from Winona LaDuke. Take a moment, take a deep breath, find our way out of our busy days, out of this life that's on steroids. Find our way where we can stare into the face of our reality, learn of its sorrow and of the despair, and also welcome the hope that change offers. So Lent is a symbolic 40 days of wandering in the desert in an empty and an arid landscape that challenges everything that distracts and clutters and hustles us along thoughtlessly. And we enter into this time of Lent so that we can connect and listen to the Spirit, to the earth, to life. Lent is a time when we let go of all the falsehoods that separate us. In the cosmos, communion is life, and separation is death. So in an email that was sent out, you were asked, what are the things that you would like to give up this Lent season to equip you and equip us to work in the climate emergency and to undo the associated oppressions? You can write those out in the chat. And I don't think I'll read off any of those things in the chat, but please do take a look at what everyone is typing in, those things that we want to give up during Lent. Thinking of our tradition, I'm at seminary right now. I'm studying Anabaptist, early Anabaptism, studying those people that got the whole Mennonite thing rolling 500 years ago. And they talked about repentance all the time, but they also talked about it as a constructive thing, as a thing that brings us to regeneration. And these are such beautiful, regeneration is a word that we have encountered from the get-go with Winona LaDuke and Naomi Klein. And it's also such a beautiful, flourishing earth image, regeneration. So we can be on that razor's edge that Seth Klein talks about, where we stare into the despair, but also hope against all hopes, that there are options out there for us to change. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change just put out a report last week. And if you heard the Secretary General Antonio Guterres you would have heard a man that was speaking of a wake-up call that you usually hear in the streets in the middle of a climate change protest. But he's he's the world's top diplomat, and he's speaking in this language too. But IPCC also says we have options. So we have options. The healthy ecosystems are the ones that that are resilient in a time of climate change. So we need to build up those depleted ecosystems so that we can together be resilient in the face of climate change. We have to reduce all of the carbon emissions and all of those things, but it's also understanding that we're deeply connected to those ecosystems that have the promise to soak up the carbon, that have the promise to breathe life into our future. So thank you for your notes, and thank you for what you're ready to, your thoughts about Lent this season. Let's just go through what's happening today. Jen is going to share with us for a while, and then we're going to go into time of question and answer. At that point, maybe about an hour from now, we'll thank Jen, and then we will, she's welcome to join us. You're welcome to join us, Jen, but we're going into our small groups. We're going to pair up again, have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then come back to the group, have a brief discussion there, have a closing prayer, and yeah, that's what our hour and a half together are going to look like. So Steve, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ian. And thank you to those of you who are starting to fill up that chat with commitments that you're making over this Lenten time. Really appreciate it. Good evening, friends. It is so good to be with you all again this week and to have opportunity to engage Jen Gobby in conversation. Thanks, Jen, for being here. Those of you who might not know Dr. Jen Gobby, she is someone who has not only thought deeply about the climate emergency, but has also been very involved in community organizing and Indigenous solidarity work for many, many years, supporting both the climate and Indigenous sovereignty movements. Jen is zooming in this evening from Quebec, where she teaches courses on the environment and climate change at Bishop's University of McGill. She also takes time in her busy schedule to come alongside groups like us, sharing her insights on climate justice, how change happens, and the ways in which we might build stronger social movements. And I think that is like a prime growing edge for faith communities. I think there's a lot of care, but we need to learn, how do we do this together? Not long ago, Jen published a wonderful book called More Powerful Together, Conversations with Climate Activists and Indigenous Land Defenders. It's a rich text that I've read, and I've passed a number of copies on to friends and colleagues. And what I really love about it is that you hear the voices and wisdoms of people on the ground who are working tirelessly for change. And I'm going to put a link to that work in the chat in just a moment so you can check it out and pick up a copy. I encourage as many of you are able to buy a copy, please do so. Unless you're not buying anything for Lent, then you're not allowed. You just wait till it finishes and then you buy one. All right. I'd like to also note that Jen has collaborated with the Indigenous Climate Action Network to co-produce some pretty significant research, including a recent report titled Decolonizing Climate Policy in Canada, which we will all be reading in a week or so. So Jen, thank you again for being here, for all your amazing work. We really look forward to hearing what you have to share and engaging you in conversation.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Steve. It's really nice to be here, and it's nice to meet you all through Zoom from where you're calling in from across the country. I just wanted to introduce myself a bit more and the path I've been on. I've been deeply concerned about climate change for, I think, since that old Al Gore movie came out in the early 2000s. So I don't remember what year that was, but that was a turning moment for me. And since then, I've been engaged in trying to affect change in all kinds of ways. For a decade, I lived on a tiny island on the West Coast. You know, I did that for a while. I did a small 3-year term in local government in BC, trying to affect change through local government. I've done a lot of activism. Now I'm an educator and researcher, and through it all, you know, I've been reflecting on what are the different levers of change, what are the different ways we can do this work that needs to happen. And so I'm always really honored to be invited, but also really excited to have conversations with folks about what they think it's going to take to address this crisis and fix a lot of the things that have been broken for a very, very long time, since long before the climate crisis was a thing. So I really have come to be quite hopeful. You know, I would say I'm more hopeful now than I was 10 years ago, and that is despite these IPCC more and more intense warnings. I somehow have come to feel more hopeful because I've surrounded myself with people who are working their asses off and care so deeply. And these are the people I surround myself with, from students that I teach to the folks I organize with, to the people I do research collaborations with. Everyone is working really hard and doing what they can to address the crisis and address the sort of injustices underlying and exacerbated by the crisis. So it's I don't know, I feel like I've found some sort of key to hope, which is being involved with movements. It's been really heartening. And then one thing that's been making me really happy lately is engaging with young folks in the courses I'm teaching at university. These are, first, second year university students who are studying environment, and they're learning in course after course how bad the crisis is, what's causing the crisis, the science behind it, the ecology, the chemistry, the physics behind it all. But there are very few courses about what are the solutions and how do we enact them and how do we bring about large-scale systemic change. So I've been trying to do that. And just today I was grading. It's reading week here, so I was catching up on grading, and the students in one class have had an assignment to write journals. So they were writing a journal entry every week, and I got to read the last 6 weeks of their journal entries, and it was amazing. It was really moving how almost all of them expressed that they feel more hopeful after the last 6 weeks of our course, which has we have just been studying climate movements. Every week it's a different movement. We've studied youth movements, we've studied divestment movements, we've been studied Indigenous land defense movements. We're studying degrowth next week, and they had no idea that so much amazing work was already happening, and they feel so happy to know that. And so I feel like, if nothing else, it's been a real, it makes me feel like I'm really contributing something to be able to help these young folks who are grappling with the existential crisis of unprecedented existential crisis globally, helping them find hope. And that hope they're finding is in looking at all the beautiful work that's going on. So I think the book that I wrote, as Steve was talking about, tries to relay some of the brilliance and hard work and deep caring that's happening in movements. So I guess I just wanted to share a bit about what's on my mind and how, helping people find and maintain hope, and then hope being the fuel that drives our action, is something that's on my mind a lot these days. So I just wanted to share that. And I teach at Bishop's and at McGill, both the universities, Anglo universities in Quebec.
Ian, you're muted.
Muted. Thank you, Jen. Thank you. And yeah, I'm still figuring out this mute button. It's crazy. Well, we have a few questions that we put together, and thank you for those of you who contributed to to our question page for our presenters. So Jen, in the online presentation that we watched together, you talk about decarbonizing not being the only goal and not the end goal for the Indigenous and climate activists you engaged. Decentralizing, democratizing, and decolonizing are central. Can you share more as to why these 3 Ds are so critical? And given our context, with only a handful of years to radically draw down greenhouse gas emissions, I can imagine some saying that we just need to focus on decarbonization. And once we get handles on that, then attend to the other matters.
Yeah, that's the heart of it, right? That is the heart of the debates that go on in social movements, but also in policy worlds. This question of can we just address the carbon problem on its own, or do we need to actually find out what's perpetuating the fossil fuel industry, what's perpetuating the power imbalances that allow the fossil fuel industry to keep going and maintain itself. So there's these various schools of thought. There's folks who think, no, actually, if we're going to address this climate crisis, we actually have to dig down to the root causes. And that's a common, almost like a mantra of the climate justice movement, that we need to address the root causes. We need to identify them and address them and target them in our strategies. Because if we don't target them, then we're not going to be able to address the crisis. So there's folks who are profoundly convinced that the only way to address the crisis is by addressing the social dynamics, the power imbalances, the political and economic systems underlying the crisis. And until we do that, we're going to keep spinning our wheels like we've been doing for 26 years of climate negotiations at the international level. So we've had 26 years of trying to tweak the carbon problem. The track record's not great, right? But I also understand the folks who say, like my doctoral supervisor, Peter Brown, great guy, but he once said that this is the left shooting itself in the foot again, trying to solve everything, and so can't solve anything, is what he once told me about my climate justice approach. And I profoundly disagree with him. I disagree. I hear that argument a lot, this pragmatism, this need to, okay, let's just bring down greenhouse gas emissions, and then we'll worry about social injustice later. We'll worry about decolonizing later. We'll worry about democratizing our political and economic systems later. Yeah, 26 years to prove that's possible. Now we have 8 years left. Let's try something else. That's what I say. So, there's when you think about the root causes, when you think about how did Canada come to be such a high emitting, high polluting, high consumption country, how did that happen? It happened through the illegal theft of Indigenous lands and the ongoing violation of their rights to access their lands, to extract resources, to fuel the economy that needs to grow incessantly through its capitalism. Capitalism demands that we have endless economic growth. Economic growth requires more and more natural resources all the time, which produces more and more pollution all the time. This is what we're locked into with the current economic political systems. And then the vested interests involved in that are very, very much part of what's blocking our ability to take effective action. Like when you read the Decolonizing Climate Policy report, you'll see Indigenous people are still structurally excluded from the decision-making tables where climate policy is made to this day in Canada, because their rights threaten the fossil fuel industry. Therefore, certain provinces have used their veto power to say no Indigenous people at this table. So the climate crisis and racism and colonization and colonialism and deep inequality is at the root of how Canada got to be such a heavy emitter and continues to be such a heavy emitter. And meanwhile, Indigenous folks are leading these movements, and they have much better track record at building diverse kinds of economies, kinds of livelihoods, protecting biodiversity, Who knows the statistics? Like 80% of biodiversity remaining on the planet is on indigenous territories. It's time, settlers, we've had our chance. We've had 26 years to show that we're capable of transforming how we live so that it can be climate friendly. And we failed that. It's time to try something new. And so my proposal is that what we try to do, or the new thing, is relinquishing the control, or colonial control, and following indigenous leadership, indigenous knowledge, and indigenous approaches to addressing the climate crisis. And there's a lot of beautiful and amazing work going on in communities and indigenous organizations like Indigenous Climate Action that really point to a much more transformative vision for climate solutions than do our settler sort of kind of band-aid tweaking approach to climate solutions. So that's some of my response to that question. But I could go on and on, but I won't.
Well, super helpful, and I'd love to hear you go on and on a bit. So I'm going to ask a question that we didn't have listed in our Q&As. Some of us, when we've gone to climate marches, we've seen signs held up that says Indigenous sovereignty is climate action. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that 1D, about decolonizing. You've talked about how, Canada's extractive economy is built on the dispossession of Indigenous lands. What does that look, in part, can you dream a little with us and say, what is, if we honor Indigenous sovereignty, and how that can be actually not just a tangential piece of, a climate action approach, but is actually, what I think you're saying is it's at the very center of this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it as like the most high leverage single policy that could be enacted that would transform everything in this country towards much more social equity, justice, and ecological sustainability, planetary viability, if you will, is land back, is hashtag land back, which has been people have been talking about returning a stolen Indigenous land to Indigenous peoples from whom it was stolen for a long time, but just in the last couple of years, there's been a hashtag and a really clear title to it, which is land back. And I feel like this would be profoundly transformative for many reasons, and it's already happening, by the way, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. There's several layers to what's going on. One is if Indigenous peoples' rights to withhold consent, to actually say no, and industry and government had to actually adhere to their no, you would see a lot less pipelines, mines, oil and gas extraction. Not none. It's not like all Indigenous people are uniformly against all extractive development, but you would see a lot less. So there was a report that came out from Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International last year that showed that Indigenous land defense over the last decade has kept an insanely large amount of carbon from being emitted, something like the equivalent of a quarter of total emissions in Canada and the US per year has been kept in the ground just from Indigenous people protecting their lands and waters. So this is Indigenous people whose rights are constantly being violated, whose land has been stolen, but still their fierce love for their lands and their communities and their waters is inspiring them to stand up and protect their lands from these projects. And this is keeping way more carbon in the ground than any Canadian, federal climate policy or carbon tax or anything has been able to do. And that is in the state of colonization. If we had decolonization where Indigenous people didn't have to build blockades and go to court and fight tooth and nail to protect their land, they could just live that stewardship on their own terms, on their own lands that are given back to them, you would see a completely different kind of decision making going on around how resources are used, around how lands and waters are cared for. So there's that level of sort of what kind of decisions get made, but there's also there's also the level of relationality, this level of like, again, not all indigenous people are the same. There's hundreds of different nations across this country alone with all kinds of different knowledge systems, cultures, traditions, worldviews, etc. But there is this tendency whereby indigenous worldviews see humans as part of nature, whereas the Western settler worldview tends to think of humans as separate, above, and dominant over nature. And I think that worldview gets manifested and perpetuated over and over and over again in economic and political policy, including in climate policy now. You see it with geoengineering, you see it with all kinds of approaches to climate that is just trying to like sort of, engineer our way out of this, as opposed to reorienting ourselves as nature, And so yet there's all these folks who already know that we're part of nature, already know what it's like to be in relationship with animal and plant relatives, yet we're constantly oppressing those folks, and they're forced to live on tiny pieces of land that do not have, enough land to be viable for livelihoods and economics, and we're forcing extractive projects onto their territories. So I really see that if indigenous peoples are given their land back and given their self-determination back, and we relinquish power and learn to unlearn some of the things that are messed up with our own culture and worldviews, and learn different ways of being and living and doing economies and doing politics. I think that it seems, I'm sure some of you are thinking that, okay, but when that's going to happen in the next 8 years. But it's already happening. So there are people across the country who are farmers who are turning over their lands to the indigenous people whose territory they're on when they're in their wills. There are people who are fundraising to buy land to return it to the communities from whom it was stolen. There are people who are starting to pay taxes to the indigenous people instead of to the local governments, a form of tax strike, instead of paying it to our federal government that is then spending it on all kinds of crazy things like policing indigenous land defense, criminalizing indigenous land offenders, surveilling them. Instead of spending our tax money on that, you can send your tax money to the indigenous communities, or putting into a fund to help buy their land back and then hand it over. So there's all these things are already happening, maybe not on the scale, but I think if we saw a graph of decolonial activism, it's rising at an exponential rate. I haven't seen that graph, but it's in my mind. I think and there's more and more, like just in Quebec, when the time I wrote that book, Quebec was really at a very, very, very beginning stage. The Quebec climate movement was at a very beginning stage of thinking about Indigenous rights as related to climate change, compared to, for example, British Columbia or other parts of the other climate parts of the other parts of the climate movement, other parts of the country. But just in the last 4 or 5 years since I wrote the book, that's completely changed due to the rise of the youth movement. And they all have a very hardcore climate justice, Indigenous sovereignty, intersectional lens. And they're demanding that the older generation sort of step back and let them take the lead. And that's involving no more like, 45 years ago, it was common that you'd have a climate rally where all the speakers were white dudes. That doesn't happen anymore in Quebec. And that's changed fundamentally due to this sort of resurgence of youth activism, and they sort of have this lens. So it's changing really, really, really quickly. And with the work of ICA and others, you're starting to see these conversations enter policy debates. And so I think things are changing really, really quickly. And I think the more the crisis intensifies, the more people will be willing to consider what it might look like to relinquish, speaking of Lent and doing without, maybe willing to think about relinquishing some of the power that settlers got through very, very immoral and illegal means. And that might be a key to a much more livable future for everybody. But that's an exercise of imagination and action that we all need to engage with.
I haven't been looking that closely with what's been happening in chat, but speaking of imagination, so we're looking at land back, just wondering what that looks like. I think we've got a big country. There's room for everybody. So what does that mean in terms of displacement for settlers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some really good things to read. I really love Arthur Manuel's Reconciliation Handbook. Reconciliation Manifesto. The late Arthur Manuel, Secwepemc political leader, amazing guy. He starts to break it down. And he proposes, even if we just talk Crown land, that's a huge amount of land. Right now, reserves make up 0.2% of Canadian land. The rest of Canada is under settler colonial control. Only 0.2% of the population, 0.2% of the land is Indigenous land, meaning reserves. So the rest of it, and most of those Crown lands, there's no people living there. That is just where resource extraction happens or nature is doing its thing. So I think, there are some Indigenous activists or land defenders who would like to see some Europeans go back to Europe, but I would say most of the people I've talked to are interested in having their traditional territories back, big enough territories that could support their economies and their livelihoods, and that there's pathways for cohabitating. So I think, we are lucky that we live in a country with so much land, that I think there's pathways forward for people not needing to go away or be displaced, but just a much more fair sharing of the land, the kind of sharing that was promised in the treaties, and then those treaties were violated again and again, that kind of fair sharing.
Thanks, Jen. That's super helpful. I know that land back conversation can rightly unsettle a lot of hearts and minds. I often go back and think about the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is it's not that radical of a report, 4,000 pages, and it has volumes 2A and 2B they could be called #landback, because that's what those volumes are all about, right? And this is a government-led commission that was saying, for self-sufficiency, for long-term health of everybody, we need to return lands.
Yeah, and just for basic human decency, like I've heard it, so the rise of the thing of doing land acknowledgements, that's just become extremely common, to the point that industry and universities and other kind of big institutions do it now. And some Indigenous folks are like, hey, you do hear how that sounds, right? It's like saying, hey, I just want to acknowledge that I stole your TV, so I still have your TV, and I'm sorry I stole it, but not giving it back. Like, it's cuckoo. It's cuckoo to be acknowledging the theft of land and not doing anything about it. So we're at this really critical moment where the awareness has been raised, but still the actual concrete action. So how are you supposed to have a relationship with that person who stole your TV or your land or whatever it is, but wants to acknowledge it but not give it back? They want to be forgiven, but they don't want to have to give it back. And then expecting to have some kind of reconciliation and some kind of building a relationship. There's no building of real relationships until that fundamental violation, that fundamental theft is righted. So I think there is enough land, but there's not enough land to do land back and still maintain our extractive economy. I think that's the fundamental tension there. But we transform our economies to a regenerative economy instead of extractive economy, all of a sudden we can be talking about there being enough land to share in a fair way that creates the context in which we can have real relationships based on consent, based on respect, based on reciprocity.
Beautiful. And I just fireworks are going off in my brain right now, because this question of reparations, the ethics around that, how it's the just thing, and it's also the right and healing thing to do. ties into the larger global conversation around loss and damage and the reparations that first world rich states owe to poor and vulnerable states that have been exploited through colonial regimes for generations. So
Can I just build on that?
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just that that debate we talked about earlier about folks thinking, no, we don't have time to do the right thing and fix everything. We need to focus on reducing emissions. There's also this sort of division between people who think, well, we have to do it. So we've got to do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the way to do an energy transition in a way that's just. But it's still sort of like, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. But I think, in my mind, yes, it's the right thing to do. But beyond that, it is the strategically powerful thing to do. And both things are very true. And so at that international level, like in this course that I've been teaching, we've been studying the evolution of the COP negotiations, the international negotiations, and noticing that in the last couple of years, the justice, the reparations, the historical responsibility has been falling off the table. In order to get agreements, more and more is just like stopping, like eroding this focus on who caused the problems and who's responsible to fix it and who's most impacted and who deserves reparations. That has been falling off the table in an effort to strategically get to agreements, and that's so profoundly dysfunctional and like moving away from actual effective action, and that's eroding because the people at the table, the people making the decisions, both in Canada and internationally, people who are making the decisions, who have the most power, are the people who are benefiting from the fossil fuel industry and the extractive economies, and the people who are not really yet feeling the impacts. Of course, bad decisions are being made by people with those vested interests, and those like disconnect from the actual impacts. And until we have a fundamental reshuffling of our political systems so that the people most impacted by the crisis and the people most impacted by the extractive economy are at the table making decisions, then we're going to see fundamentally different decisions getting made that could forge the way towards economies that don't need to extract, but that can regenerate. Yeah.
Awesome. That's so helpful. Personally, that making the link between what is right and what is strategic is something I know that I need to take home from this conversation. What you just shared ties into our next question. So we talked a little bit about how this recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report came out. I think a lot of us, that hits hard, and we realize to quote the IPCC, we need rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society in order to prevent, collapse. Now, in your work, you've engaged people in the very trenches of climate action. And some of these people believe that climate action requires, pressuring and influencing settler governments, policies, and election outcomes. Others are perhaps, I don't know what the right language is, maybe more radical. They're pushing beyond visions of reform and toward revolution, imagining a dismantling of existing power structures. And perhaps others are not focused on these structures at all, but they're doing their work on their ground in their territories. In the Seth Klein text that we're all reading, Klein proposes a model for climate mobilization that relies heavily on state action and policy. It has a central role of the state, alongside a robust recognition of Indigenous rights and title. Based on your experience and your study and your activism, where have you landed in this discussion, and how does your politics impact your understanding of what actions groups like ourselves need to engage in?
Okay, so I love that question, and it's another question at the heart of what's on my mind all the time. And I feel like I've landed somewhere where I think all that is very, very necessary. We've seen from, the election of Trump and the rise of the far right, we need to be very alert to what's going on in the electoral politics, because huge damage can be done, huge backsliding of all kind of progressive changes happened over the last decades. You know, we need to be very attentive to that and work really, really hard at doing our best to have as progressive as possible elected officials in there. So that's, I think there's a quote in More Powerful Together, one of the activists said, like, no movements have the luxury of ignoring that front. That said, we also can't put all our eggs in that basket, because there's a lot of reasons to believe that there are too many structural barriers, invested interests in that realm, to think that they're going to be the ones who are going to lead the solutions or lead the fight, or not single-handedly, but, you know, get us where we need to go. So I think it's somehow all that. But I think, like, you could sense it in the book that I place most of my hope and my strategic energy towards social movements, radical social movements, grassroots social movements, and frontline communities. So, because I think those are the folks who have the clear vision of what's wrong and what needs to happen. They're the people who are not constrained by vested interests, by, you know, funding structures, by I don't know what, who can say and do what needs to be said and done. So I have, but of course, social movements, there's a lot of vibrancy there and a lot of energy and power there, but they're also hugely underfunded, this kind of thing. So I think in my current best thinking on it, any ways that we could be funneling energy, resources, labor, any kind of support to frontline struggles, so that's Indigenous land defense struggles, you know, youth activism, you know, grassroots climate work, whatever it is, communities on the front lines of climate impacts, but also the front lines of extractivism, any kind of energy, resources, time we could be funneling there is the most impactful. So if we saw that, you know, Indigenous land defenders were able to keep that much carbon in the ground over the last decade, what could they do if they had the full force of the average concerned Canadian behind them in terms of material and even like ideological support, you know, even raising awareness. There's so much that could be done to support those frontline struggles much more, both symbolically and materially. I think that's what I was trying to say, and that's where I think I see the most potential power to transform things very, very quickly. So, for example, I finished my postdoc a couple of months ago, and in trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, I knew I didn't want to, you know, become a prof, even if there were jobs, that kind of jobs available, which they're not. But that's not what I want to do. I don't want to be stuck in a university for whatever, you know, for my productive years, whatever I have in me. And so what I've done is started this new thing called Research for the Front Lines, and where it's kind of a matchmaking service where I'm connecting with land defenders and other frontline movements and communities and seeing, do they have any research needs? Anything they'd like to research, gathering information, gathering evidence, doing writing, this kind of thing, whatever it is, and matching them up with folks, researchers, profs, graduate students who want to help but don't know how to, you know, where to send their support. So and helping people, matching people up, you know, creating these sort of research teams. And so far, we, like, just in the last couple of months, we've mobilized like something like 800 hours of volunteer research labor for frontline struggles. And from, you know, studying everything from the policing of Prairie Creek to understanding the causes of moose population decline in Algonquin territory, to also, we just did a big research study on tax strikes. One of our frontline struggle collaborators wanted to understand how to use tax strikes as a strategy. So we had a report that just came out today about the history of tax strikes, what's worked in the past, what's possible, what would be recommended for this moment in time. So that's just one example of like a high leverage way to just funnel energy, resources, time, skills towards frontline struggles. And so I'd love to see more and more in that, more and more in that. And that's so, yeah. And maybe that sometimes if people in my position, it could mean applying for government funding to do research and then funneling it all to the front lines. So some of us are well positioned to access some of the kind of, use our academic or settler or white privilege to access things that other people can't, and then funnel them. And if we had 100 times more people doing that than are doing that now, I think they would shift things profoundly.
There's a question that came early on in the chat that sort of picks up on that a bit, and I guess the one part that I found great in your presentation was this. Was recognizing the internal conflict in climate movements, and also recognizing that that a lot of it is due to sexism and racism, and where the power and the money is typically with the white men making decisions and holding the purse strings. So. And I felt it was really well conveyed when you said that we have to stop saying come join our cause, and instead go how can we join your cause. I feel that what you're talking about is relating to that a bit. And Scott asks something, is asking a question about, how can climate action groups led by settlers start to be more effectively build those connections and take the initiative from some of the more marginalized groups, even in the climate action movement.
Yeah, I feel like that's the heart of it, right? Is not reaching out and asking Indigenous folks or other folks of color to come and be part of your thing, but find all kinds of Indigenous groups and communities are constantly doing really great media stuff, putting out calls to action, asking for days of solidarity, asking for donations. Like, there are tons of people who've already said what they need and what kind of support they need. And all we have to do is pay attention, share those things, so join their movements, actively support those movements. And there's so many ways to do it. Like, I love that you're going to be reading the Decolonizing Climate Policy report. Like, when Indigenous-led organizations put out policy stuff, read that, and discuss it and figure out how to, I can't tell you how many people wrote to ICA, like big NGOs, big settler-led NGOs, saying, "Hey, I saw that new report. Can you give us a webinar on it?" We're like, "How about you just read it?" Like, how about you just read it? You know what I mean? Like, but they wanted to engage with the ICA team and learn from the ICA team. But the ICA team had just spent months putting together this report, So this trying to find ways to support as opposed to ask for people's energy, or to try to extract. And there's so many incredible Indigenous-led efforts right now around sovereignty, around food, around energy, around climate, all kinds of things. So much to learn from and to follow and to support. That I think there's endless potential for how we could be supporting. But it does mean, like, building those relationships does mean attending really closely to power dynamics and who's calling the shots, and who like, something that's transformed quickly since writing that, like, another thing that's changed a lot since I wrote that book is that now in a lot of the pipeline struggles, the NGOs are figuring out or experimenting with ways to actually play supportive roles instead of being the ones to control the messaging and the strategy, which they had been just like 4 or 5 years ago. So there's a lot of ways that even in the big NGO world, they're finding ways to experiment with relinquishing control and seeing how that feels. So that feels really, really hopeful. Yeah.
Super helpful. Jen, could I ask you a question? You mentioned NGOs, and More Powerful Together has a bunch of pieces talking about Indigenous communities' relationships, problematic often with NGOs. I'm curious, around the circle were representatives from all these different faith communities. So everything from the Quaker to United, Unitarian, and Catholic and Mennonite. Curious whether or not in your research, conversations around working with faith bodies ever comes up. And if there's total silence, that can also communicate a lot as well. But what if there were some conversations from land defenders, climate activists around faith communities? What are some of the things that we need to learn potentially as faith bodies in this work of solidarity? You mentioned some of them just in the previous response, but I'm curious whether or not there were things that came out from your on the ground experience.
On some of the conversations I had with folks digging at the root causes, Christianity did come up as sort of part of how the Western worldview came to think of humans as having dominion over the earth, and that that nature is just here to serve us. And I know that's one interpretation of. I'm no theologian, so I'm not sure, but that it was raised, and so I think there is a powerful role that folks like yourselves have to retell that story, or to transform that story, that legacy of Christianity as humans being God's chosen people or something. And I know that there's a lot of teachings that sort of have the opposite kind of story that are about caring for and being part of and this kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of powerful work to be done that you folks are well positioned to lead about what does it look like for us to be settler folks being unlearning some of those profound underlying stories of the humanity's role on the planet, and then leading some of the relearning new understandings. I think faith has a big role to play in fueling the kind of change that's necessary. Now I'm not so much talking about what folks told me in the research, but I'm just sort of sharing my own thoughts. But I do think that faith does have a big role to play in fueling people's willingness to take action, and just to do without, and to really envision what life is all about and what we're here to do, and what's meaningful and what's important. And I think when people talk about what we need to do in the climate crisis, is move away from capitalism. A lot of people are concerned, well, are we going to have to not have TVs? Are we going to not have luxuries? Are we not be able to have my own car? I'm not going to be able to make more and more money. People feel insecure, but there's more and more research coming out all the time that more money does not make people more happy. That people in richer countries tend to be have less well-being, and that after a certain amount of money per year per person, I think it's like 20 grand or something, more money does not make us more happy. So I think there's a lot of work, roles to be played by people of faith in showing what things bring meaning to human existence that are not about consumption, not about money, not about extracting and pillaging, but about something things that are much more beautiful and sustainable and just. So that's some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for those comments. It reminds me of, we have some recovery work to do and dismantling work in our faith communities. There's a reason why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and then even the Royal Commission was flagging things like the doctrine of discovery, which is, part of our Christian story that we need to repudiate, or the TRC calling us to respect Indigenous spirituality. Well, that's connected to, a lot of the work on the ground in these frontline communities as well. So there's a ton of work we got to do to do our part as well.
I have been hearing that there's been a lot of divestment work going on in church communities. People forcing their churches to divest from fossil fuels. I hear there's a lot of incredible leadership going on, and that sounds amazing.
And I think there are some of these stories. My experience, though, when it comes to, and maybe people's experience in this circle is different, when it comes to the climate movement on the ground, you name youth, you name Indigenous folks, and then we have like the NGOs like Greenpeace and 350.org and all that. But labor and faith seem to be largely missing in action. And so it just feels like this is a moment where we have a lot of responsibility to step up, not take leadership, but to support, resource, and to live into our responsibilities. But not to say there isn't other good stuff going on.
Hey, and another thing with that is that I once heard a woman, I forget her name, but she's a labor organizer, union organizer. She's talking at an academic conference about anti-capitalism, and she was saying that one thing that the climate movement is getting wrong is organizing, just like issue organizing, trying to get people from wherever to come and join group, climate groups or whatever. But she says the way you actually have to do it is organizing in existing social, in community groups. So like in the workplace, in church congregations, in local communities, like where people already have a social fabric, or people already know each other and can collaborate and work together, as opposed to always trying to cobble communities together to work together on climate stuff. So I think there's something powerful there too with church communities already have that social fabric that's required to take collective action, So it's already like half the work, I think. Instead of building organizations or building coalitions, you already have that social fabric. So I think that's something really
That's
important.
encouraging. Yeah, super helpful. It sounds a lot like what Catherine Hayhoe, climate scientist, says in her latest book. But before I go down that trail, Ian, you have any last question to ask Jen?
I don't know. Do we have time for another question, or
Jen, are you okay if we fudge the hour a little bit? All right.
I'm just wondering. I love in your theory of change. Context is important in it, and also values. I forget the exact phrase that you use for values in that image, that visual you give for it. But there's got to be some interplay between context and values, especially if we're pretty attached to our values. It's hard to be nimble enough to work in specific contexts. And I'm asking this as a church person. We aren't always terribly nimble. We really hang on to our convictions and maybe attach them to some other contexts that we the Western worldview, entering into a new world and not being nimble enough to see the context we're in, for instance. I'm wondering what are the hints to have a good bit of interplay between our values and that context, and recognizing the context we're in.
I don't know. I guess there's some dance between holding on to the core of what you hold dear or sacred, at the same time as always having our minds changeable, like it's so always learning from the world as it's changing, and learning from people as we are interacting with them. So letting our minds be open and changing and malleable, while whatever our core values can stay strong. Because I mean, there are some things that are just and to me, what's at the core of my values is about relationships, and about what, Kyle White, he's a Potawatomi scholar who writes a lot about Indigenous climate justice. I really recommend reading his work. He's talking about relational tipping points, as opposed to, or as well as ecological tipping points, but that there are certain relational qualities that are required if we're going to take collective action together to address climate change, and they involve consent, reciprocity, respect, and one other, which I forget right now. But through everything I do, that's at the core of everything I do, is like thinking about how do you build the relationships, the kind of relationships that are necessary to build the kind of communities and movements that it's going to take to survive this thing and transform the way we live on this planet. So Kyle White, so WHYTE, Kyle White, he's a prof at I forget which university, I think in Minnesota. But so I think everyone has that, like what's at the heart, what's most important to them, and then holding on to that and keep letting that be your anchor, but then letting your mind change and constantly learning new things. Like, I don't think there's anyone who hasn't been transformed by the COVID pandemic, you know, like our lives have been transformed, our ways of relating to others have transformed, our relationships with families have transformed, and that's all context, you know, that's all the world changing and us changing with it. And so I think like seeing, I just about to put out a report of a project I did during COVID that's looking at how do we get better at seizing crisis moments to transform our economic and political systems, and looking at how community organizers in Montreal have been seizing the COVID moment to push for transformative change in the city, or that city. But that's what I think a lot about, because crises are going to just be coming and coming, and how do we get good at seizing those contexts, like those moments, those political, ecological, social moments, how do we get good at seizing those moments to transform the way we live, the way our societies are organized, the way we take care of ourselves and each other. So yeah, that's some of my thoughts about context and what we hold strong to and what we let shift. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. Really terrific discussion. I marvel at your access to so much information and so much of what's been going on currently. So thank you very much for bringing us that to us, and the being so very generous with all that you're all working on, and what you yourself are learning. So thank you very much for joining the group. And we have our glittery hands here that we
I like that. It was a very, very big pleasure to meet you all. It's been an honor to have this conversation with you, and thank you to all of you and all the work you're doing, and the learning and the unlearning and the taking action and the taking care of each other and yourselves.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jen. So appreciate this.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.